The Second World War ended not with silence, but with murmurs that rippled through the ruins of Europe. Nations were rebuilding, borders were shifting, and in the smoky corridors of Washington and London, men whispered about a new kind of conflict, one that would be fought without battlefields or uniforms. They called it a war for the mind. From the ashes of the old OSS, the United States created an organization designed not just to gather intelligence, but to shape reality itself. It was called the Central Intelligence Agency. In its infancy, the CIA did not look like the all-powerful institution that later filled the imagination of novelists and paranoiacs. It was a handful of war-hardened analysts in cramped offices, a few field agents left over from the resistance networks of Europe, and a new directive written in language so broad that it bordered on poetic. Conduct operations necessary to protect the security of the free world. No one yet knew what those words meant, and that vagueness became its greatest weapon. Within it lay permission to do almost anything. The Cold War was taking shape. The Soviet Union, once a grim ally, was now the mirror opposite of everything America claimed to be. Stalin had absorbed Eastern Europe and tightened the Iron Curtain. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, erasing the illusion of American invincibility. 2 years later, the Korean War erupted, and the idea of global confrontation felt less theoretical, more inevitable. But unlike the wars of the past, this one would not be won by numbers of tanks or planes. It would be won by perception, by whose version of the world ordinary people believed. That realization electrified the new agency. A small group of planners inside the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination began developing what they called psychological operations. The term was clinical, but the goal was audacious: to weaponize information, art, and culture in service of ideology. If the Soviets relied on censorship and propaganda, the Americans would counter with abundance: so much noise, so much beauty, so many dazzling images of freedom that the world would simply drown in it. Money began to move quietly through shell foundations and academic grants. The CIA became a hidden patron of Western culture, financing magazines, concerts, exhibitions, and lectures, all carrying an invisible watermark of American optimism. To the public, it looked spontaneous, the flowering of a creative society. To the agency, it was a campaign. In Paris, Rome, and Berlin, elegant conferences were convened under the banner of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Poets debated politics over champagne. Painters discussed existentialism beneath modern chandeliers. None of them suspected their hotel bills were being paid by Langley. The Congress became a global network of journals and institutions, shaping opinion through subtle suggestion. Every article that defended individual liberty, every essay that denounced totalitarianism, became another thread in the invisible web. Back home, another front opened: the world of art. In the austere studios of post-war Manhattan, a new movement was emerging. Vast canvases, explosive colors, abstract forms that defied logic. Jackson Pollock flinging paint like artillery fire. Mark Rothko layering soft light and sorrow. Willem de Kooning wrestling with chaos itself. Critics were bewildered, but to the CIA's cultural strategists, this chaos was gold. Here was proof that freedom produced creativity the Soviets could never imitate. Through discreet partnerships with the Museum of Modern Art, whose board included several men with intelligence ties, the agency helped fund international exhibitions that turned American abstract art into a symbol of democracy itself. It was propaganda without a single slogan. No flags, no speeches, just emotion. The irony was exquisite. The same government that paraded freedom overseas often distrusted these artists at home. Congressional committees called their work decadent, immoral, even communist. But abroad, their canvases hung like banners of liberty. The CIA didn't care about contradictions. It cared about influence. Music joined the offensive next. Jazz, America's most spontaneous art form, became a diplomatic weapon. Bands led by Dizzy Gillespie and Louis Armstrong toured Eastern Europe and Africa, their horns echoing across Cold War fault lines. The message was implicit: a society that could improvise could never be enslaved. Few in the audiences knew that embassy officials and covert cultural officers had arranged the tours, or that their travel funds traced back to secret budgets. The rhythm of freedom had been orchestrated. But influence campaigns are never pure. Behind the elegant facade of art and intellect lay experiments of another kind, ones that reached deep into the mind itself. In the early 1950s, CIA scientists began to ask a chilling question. If ideas could liberate, could they also control? Could the human mind be rewritten like a code? Under the umbrella of projects with names like Bluebird and MKUltra, researchers tested drugs, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation on volunteers, and often on victims who never gave consent. LSD, then an obscure compound from a Swiss lab, became the agency's obsession. Doctors dosed soldiers, prisoners, even hospital patients, watching as reality dissolved. They hoped to discover a truth serum, a weapon against brainwashing, perhaps even a key to controlling memory. What they found instead was a mirror of their own delusion. That fear of losing control had turned them into the very thing they feared. Reports filtered back to Washington, written in the sterile language of science, but soaked in moral chaos. Subjects left broken, psychotic, amnesic. Some died, others vanished into asylums. Files were shredded, budgets buried in innocuous line items. In time, most of it was forgotten, or rather, suppressed. Yet the whispers persisted. For every painting the CIA shipped to Paris, another secret lived in the basements of its laboratories. At the same time abroad, the agency grew bolder. In 1953, it orchestrated the coup in Iran that toppled Prime Minister Mossadegh, replacing a democratically elected leader with a compliant monarch. The following year it repeated the pattern in Guatemala, removing another reformist government under the banner of anti-communism. To the architects in Langley, these operations were triumphs. To the citizens of those nations, they were the moment democracy became a mask. The CIA's influence now extended from galleries to governments, from minds to nations. Back home, the machinery of persuasion expanded into domestic life. Hollywood thrillers began featuring heroic intelligence officers battling faceless communist villains. Television news echoed official narratives. Even consumer advertising became a subtle echo of ideology. The bright promise of the American dream, new cars, suburban homes, smiling families, was both comfort and command. Keep buying, keep believing, keep quiet. The agency didn't have to dictate this culture, it merely nudged it, confident that freedom packaged as luxury was the strongest antidote to doubt. The paradox deepened. The more America preached freedom, the more it relied on secrecy. Congress rarely questioned the budgets. Presidents looked the other way. Ordinary citizens assumed the guardians of liberty knew best. But inside the system, paranoia fed on itself. Every success demanded deeper concealment. Each layer of deception required another beneath it. What began as defense became dependence. By the mid-1950s, truth itself had become classified. The journalists who tried to peer into the darkness often found themselves entangled in it. Some, like those writing for Encounter magazine in London or the Paris Review in New York, discovered years later that their platforms had been funded by front organizations. The revelation shocked them. They had believed they were independent voices fighting tyranny. And they were. But their microphones had been purchased by the very machine they thought they opposed. The Cold War had blurred morality into a spectrum of convenience. Still, the art survived. Pollock's splatters, Rothko's silent fields, the jazz improvisations, all outlived the propaganda. The government could use them, but it could not own them. That, in the end, was the paradox that haunted the men of the CIA's cultural branch. They had proven that freedom was beautiful, but they had done so by secretly controlling it. As the decade waned, cracks appeared in the facade. A few congressmen began asking how far the agency's invisible hand reached. Former officers, uneasy with what they had seen, began leaking stories to sympathetic reporters. Words like mind control and covert funding began to surface in print, dismissed at first as conspiracy, but lingering like smoke. The American public, still basking in post-war comfort, didn't yet grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. But the ground was shifting. The CIA had built an empire of perception, so vast that even its own directors couldn't map its edges. It had transformed information into power, power into culture, culture into identity. The question no one asked was whether, in doing so, it had also transformed democracy itself. By the close of the 1950s, the line between reality and illusion had blurred into something permanent. Every citizen lived inside a story engineered for stability, the narrative of progress, prosperity, and righteous vigilance. The Soviet threat was real, but so was the need to believe in innocence. America's greatness depended on never asking what lay behind the curtain. The curtain, however, was beginning to move, and when it finally lifted in the decades to come, the world would glimpse the cost of winning a war that could never be declared. The curtain was beginning to move. In the early 1960s, a series of leaks cracked the facade of perfection. Former agents began whispering to reporters about experiments that blurred the line between defense and depravity. There were mentions of chemical trials, hypnotic interrogation, and strange projects buried under layers of classification. Congress barely understood the scale. Most Americans dismissed the rumors as conspiracy fantasies. The government of the atomic age could never be so crude, they said. But reality had been stranger than fiction for years. What finally forced the truth to the surface wasn't outrage, it was bureaucracy. In 1963, a single memo, misfiled and later recovered, mentioned a Sub-Project 130, behavioral modification studies. It was a small crack in the wall, but light began to seep through. Over the next decade, journalists would dig, senators would question, and an entire architecture of secrecy would start to crumble. MKUltra, the name that would become synonymous with Cold War horror, was exposed piece by piece. Hundreds of human experiments, many without consent, some resulting in death. Doses of LSD slipped into drinks at parties. University grants funding hypnosis research that was anything but academic. Even in Canada, entire psychiatric hospitals unknowingly participated in tests that erased patients' identities under the guise of treatment. The agency burned most of its records in 1973, but what remained was enough to shock a nation that had believed it was the moral light of the world. The hearings that followed in the 1970s, first the Rockefeller Commission, then the Church Committee, finally pulled the curtain down. Senators read testimonies that sounded like nightmares, agents dosing their colleagues, scientists experimenting on prisoners, politicians approving budgets without ever knowing what they were funding. What disturbed the public most wasn't the science itself, but the attitude behind it, the bureaucratic calm with which freedom's guardians had rationalized turning human beings into data. The discovery shattered what remained of the government's moral aura. The CIA, once mythologized as America's invisible shield, was now seen as its shadow. But the paradox remained. Even as outrage grew, so did fascination. The agency that had infiltrated culture had also branded itself within it. Movies, novels, and television shows transformed spies into icons. James Bond drank his martinis while real agents shredded files. On-screen, espionage looked glamorous. Off-screen, it looked insane. The world had learned to love its own manipulation. Propaganda had folded in on itself until truth and illusion were indistinguishable. In the wake of the revelations, reforms were promised. Oversight committees were established. Budgets were tightened, oversight strengthened. Yet secrecy has gravity, and once created, it pulls everything toward it. Within a few years, the machinery was running again, smaller, quieter, more careful. The Cold War was not over, and information remained its most valuable weapon. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the battlefield had expanded. Vietnam had become a televised apocalypse. The American government learned that managing perception was as important as managing troops. Networks aired nightly footage of burning villages, body bags, and protests in the streets. Public opinion became a strategic variable. To influence it, the same psychological playbook once used abroad was now being applied at home. Briefings were scripted like advertising campaigns. Words like pacification and collateral damage replaced uglier truths. The manipulation had matured. It no longer needed to hide. It merely changed the language. Meanwhile, the cultural experiment that had begun in the 1950s had taken on a life of its own. The artists once funded in secret now shaped the mainstream. Abstract expressionism gave way to pop art, mass media to counterculture. The CIA had unleashed creativity it could no longer control. The children of the very propaganda it had sponsored now rebelled against authority itself. Bob Dylan's protest songs, Warhol's ironic portraits, the psychedelic revolution, all were distant echoes of a campaign that had tried to prove freedom could not be contained. In trying to stage managed liberty, the state had accidentally made it real. Yet beneath that chaotic flowering, a deeper transformation was underway. Propaganda, once a tool of governments, was becoming a structure of society itself. Advertising borrowed the techniques of psychological operations. Market research replaced ideology with emotion. If the CIA had experimented with controlling perception, corporations perfected it. The consumer became the new subject of influence. The same nation that had feared communist brainwashing now invited commercial hypnosis every night through the television. The difference was consent, or the illusion of it. As the 1980s arrived, the Cold War entered its cinematic phase. The enemy was caricatured, the victories dramatized. Movies like Top Gun and Rambo became recruitment posters wrapped in entertainment. The CIA learned to outsource its storytelling. Hollywood did the work for free. Freedom was now an aesthetic. Fast jets, neon lights, confident smiles. Behind the spectacle, the same machinery of secrecy continued, only now it no longer needed to persuade, it simply entertained. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War, the great contest of ideology, ended not with a bomb but with a whisper. The world exhaled. The shadow network seemed to dissolve into history, a relic of paranoia. Files were declassified. Former agents published memoirs. The United States stood triumphant, convinced that the information war had been won. But wars of the mind don't end, they evolve. The tools of manipulation, once built for global ideological struggle, now found new hosts, corporations, political campaigns, eventually the internet itself. By the dawn of the 21st century, the techniques born in the back rooms of Langley had gone digital. Psychological profiling replaced field reports. Algorithms replaced analysts. What the CIA once did to the world, social media began doing to everyone. The infrastructure of persuasion had outgrown its creators. No one needed front organizations or cultural congresses anymore. Influence could be bought with data, delivered at the speed of thought, disguised as choice. The shadow network had become decentralized. It no longer needed secrecy. It thrived in transparency. People willingly participated in their own manipulation, trading privacy for convenience, truth for entertainment, autonomy for attention. The machinery of influence had gone from covert to overt, from government to everyone. In a strange way, the ghosts of the 1950s were still here, whispering through code and screens. The same logic that once guided propaganda about freedom now guided algorithms about engagement. Both relied on the same premise: people are most predictable when they believe they are free. The techniques had evolved, but the architecture was familiar. Control the narrative, shape perception, keep the illusion of choice alive. The battle for the mind had gone mainstream. And yet, there is a lesson buried beneath all that manipulation, a paradox that even the Cold War's engineers could never solve. Influence, once unleashed, cannot be contained. The CIA's cultural projects proved it in the 1950s, and the Internet proves it now. Every attempt to steer thought creates unintended currents. The agency wanted to demonstrate the superiority of freedom, and in doing so, created art that questioned authority. Tech companies wanted to connect the world, and in doing so, made truth impossible to contain. Control is always temporary, curiosity always escapes. Looking back, it's easy to condemn the secrecy, the arrogance, the cruelty of those early experiments. But perhaps the more disturbing truth is that we are still living inside their legacy. The idea that reality can be engineered, that stories can be optimized, that emotion can be turned into leverage, these are not relics of the Cold War. They are the defining features of our age. We have inherited the CIA's dream and made it democratic. Every influencer, every political campaign, every corporate brand is now a micro version of the shadow network, shaping the world not through force, but through suggestion. When the agency first began its psychological operations, its planners spoke of a simple goal: to make truth stronger than lies. They never realized the danger of trying to manufacture truth. Because once you can create it, you can replace it. The power they built was too seductive, too adaptable. The world they left us is one where everyone is both subject and spy, both audience and actor, both believer and manipulator. So when we scroll through endless feeds of outrage and certainty, when we find ourselves defending opinions we barely chose, when reality feels curated instead of lived, we are walking through the ruins of that first invisible war. The CIA did not just fight the Cold War, it defined the template for every information conflict that came after. The battlefield expanded from nations to networks, from ideology to identity. The weapons got smaller, faster, and cheaper, but the target never changed. It was always us. And in that sense, the shadow network never disappeared. It merely decentralized into billions of glowing screens. Each of us now carries a piece of it in our pocket, whispering stories tailored to our fears, our hopes, our biases. The Cold War promised a battle between freedom and control. What we got instead was their fusion, a world where control is invisible and freedom is engineered. The true legacy of the 1950s intelligence revolution isn't espionage or coups, it's the normalization of manipulation as a fact of life. What was once secret is now mundane. What was once an operation is now an industry. The shadow network has become the air we breathe. If there's any hope, it lies in remembering. Because to see the network is to weaken it. To understand the mechanics of influence is to reclaim a fraction of autonomy. History does not absolve, but it can illuminate. The same way the Congress for Cultural Freedom once turned art into politics, awareness can turn propaganda into perspective. The war for the mind is unwinnable, but it is survivable if we keep asking who benefits from what we believe. The story of the CIA's invisible empire is not just a warning about secrecy, it's a mirror held up to the present. It reminds us that truth, once treated as a weapon, will never again belong to anyone. It drifts, changes, and resists capture. The men who thought they could control it are gone, but the system they built still hums beneath the surface, adapting to every new technology. It no longer needs to hide because it has become the background noise of civilization itself. And so we return to where it began, to the quiet offices in 1947, to the idea that a small group of people could shape how the world thinks. They succeeded beyond their imagination, but every act of control plants the seed of rebellion. Somewhere, in a studio or a comment thread or a forgotten corner of the internet, another artist, another writer, another ordinary person is creating something that refuses to fit the narrative. The system will absorb some of it, distort some of it, silence some of it, but not all. That defiance is the last freedom that can't be engineered. The Cold War taught us that power and fear are easy to build. What's hard is trust. And in the end, that is what the shadow network could never manufacture. Trust must be earned, not programmed. The men who designed the invisible machinery of persuasion forgot that truth is not something you can control. It's something that slips through your fingers the moment you try to own it. That is their final legacy, and our inheritance. Because the real war for the mind never ended, it just went online. And if you listen closely, beneath the noise of headlines and algorithms, you can still hear it, the faint hum of the old machines, the echo of the whispers that built the modern world. In the end, the shadows didn't disappear, they just learned how to glow.